September 1945. A warehouse outside Tokyo, Japan. American military scientists stood before 300,000 pages of medical research, detailed logs, photographs, experimental data more comprehensive than anything produced by legitimate medical institutions. The kind of meticulous documentation that scientists dream of, except for one horrifying detail. Every single page represented someone's torture. Every graph charted a human being's suffering. Every photograph captured the moment when another prisoner's screams stopped being recorded because they'd finally died. The lead scientist, a U.S. Army medical officer named Colonel Murray Sanders, held one particular document in his hands. It was a temperature chart showing how long it takes for a human being to freeze to death in various conditions. The data was precise, methodical, scientifically invaluable, and it had been obtained by literally freezing prisoners alive while recording their vital signs until they died. Sanders faced an impossible choice, the choice that would define how the world responded to the greatest medical atrocities in human history. He could burn these documents, destroy the data, ensure that knowledge gained through torture would never benefit anyone. That would be the moral choice. The righteous choice, or he could take the data. Study it. Use it to save American lives. Soldiers who might be rescued from freezing waters. Pilots who might survive being shot down in winter conditions. Civilians who could be treated for cold injuries with protocols developed from this nightmare research. One choice honored the victims by refusing to profit from their suffering. The other choice might save thousands of Allied lives by using information that couldn't be obtained any other way. Because no ethical scientist could ever reproduce these experiments. The data was unique, irreplaceable, and utterly tainted. Sanders looked at his fellow officers. Some were visibly disgusted. Others were already calculating how this research could be applied to military medicine. And in that moment, a decision was made that would remain classified for decades. But before we reveal what the Allies actually did with this data, and trust me, the truth is far more complex than you imagine, we need to understand exactly what they discovered. Because the experiments conducted by Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan weren't just cruel, they were systematic, scientifically documented, and far more extensive than most people realize. If you think you know this story, you don't. Hit that subscribe button right now because what we're about to reveal will challenge everything you thought you knew about how World War II actually ended. And drop a comment below on what you think the Allies should have done. We'll get to what they actually did soon enough. The warehouse that Colonel Sanders stood in wasn't just any storage facility. It was the archived remains of one of history's most horrific medical programs. A program so secret that even most Japanese military officials didn't know its full scope. A program that conducted experiments on human beings that make Nazi concentration camp horrors look almost merciful by comparison. Its official designation was Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. That bureaucratic title was a lie designed to hide its true purpose. But everyone who knew the truth called it by its real name. Unit 731, and the man who created it was still walking free, protected by American military authorities, in exchange for exactly what Sanders was looking at, 300,000 pages of research that no ethical scientist could ever replicate. But to understand why American forces made deals with the monsters who created this data, you need to understand exactly what Unit 731 was. And I'm warning you now, what comes next is disturbing, not sensationalized, not exaggerated, just the documented historical truth of what human beings are capable of doing to other human beings when they convince themselves it's for science. Experiments began in 1937. The location was Pingfang, a district near Harbin in Manchuria, which Japan had occupied and renamed Manchukuo. The facility covered 6 square kilometers and included laboratories, barracks, crematoriums, and prison blocks specifically designed to hold what the researchers called logs, their dehumanizing term for the human prisoners they experimented on. The man in charge was Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, a microbiologist and Army medical officer who had convinced Japanese military leadership that biological warfare could win wars. Ishii was brilliant, charismatic, and utterly devoid of empathy. He saw human prisoners not as people but as research materials, experimental subjects to be used, documented, and disposed of, and the Japanese military gave him unlimited resources to pursue his vision. What Ishii created wasn't just a research facility. It was an industrialized horror show where human experimentation happened on a scale that's almost incomprehensible. Conservative estimates suggest at least 3,000 people died in Unit 731's experiments. Some historians believe the real number exceeded 10,000 when you include field tests of biological weapons on Chinese villages. But what made Unit 731 uniquely valuable to Allied scientists wasn't just the scale. It was the documentation. Because Ishii wasn't just a sadist, he was a scientist who insisted on meticulous record-keeping. Every experiment was photographed, charted, analyzed. Every variable was controlled. Every result was documented with the kind of precision that legitimate medical research aspires to, which meant that when Allied forces discovered these archives, they weren't looking at random acts of cruelty. They were looking at systematic scientific research that answered questions no ethical experiment could ever address. Questions like, how does plague spread through human populations? What's the lethal dose of anthrax when delivered as an aerosol? How long can human organs survive without oxygen? What happens to human tissue when exposed to extreme cold? These aren't academic questions. They're medical mysteries that could save lives, if you're willing to accept that the answers were written in the blood of innocent prisoners. Drop a comment below. Is knowledge gained through torture ever acceptable to use? Keep watching because the answer the Allies gave might shock you. The specific experiments conducted at Unit 731 weren't just cruel, they were designed to answer practical military questions that Japan's biological warfare program needed answered. Let me walk you through some of what Allied investigators discovered in those archives, and as I do, understand that every single experiment I'm describing is documented, verified, and horrifyingly real. Frostbite research. This is what Colonel Sanders was looking at in that warehouse. Unit 731 researchers wanted to understand how to treat cold weather injuries because Japanese troops were fighting in Manchuria's brutal winters. So they exposed prisoners to sub-zero temperatures, sometimes by forcing them to hold their arms in ice water, sometimes by taking them outside in freezing weather with body parts deliberately exposed. The researchers would then test different rewarming methods: hot water, gradual warming, rapid warming. They documented which methods worked best, which methods caused the least tissue damage, which methods saved the most lives. The data was comprehensive, detailed, and scientifically rigorous. And every data point represented a human being who screamed as their flesh froze, who begged for mercy that never came, who died so that Japanese military doctors could write down what happened. But frostbite research was almost gentle compared to what came next. Because Unit 731's primary mission wasn't treating injuries, it was weaponizing disease, which meant they needed to understand how diseases spread, how quickly they killed, and how to make them more effective as weapons. The plague experiments were particularly systematic. Prisoners would be deliberately infected with plague bacteria, sometimes through injection, sometimes by being locked in rooms where plague-carrying fleas were released. Researchers would then monitor the progression of the disease. How long until symptoms appeared? How long until death? What was the infection rate when multiple prisoners were housed together? They tested anthrax the same way: cholera, typhoid, smallpox, every major disease that could potentially be weaponized. And they didn't just infect prisoners and observe. They dissected them while still alive to see what the disease was doing to internal organs in real time. This is where the term vivisection appears in Unit 731 records: live dissection. Surgery performed on conscious prisoners without anesthesia, not to save their lives but to observe how disease and injury affected organs while those organs were still functioning in a living body. I know this is disturbing. That's exactly why we need to talk about it. Because what the Allies did with this information was kept secret for decades. If this story matters to you, hit that like button and share this video. The truth needs to be told, even when it's uncomfortable. The archives Colonel Sanders and his team discovered included photographs, thousands of photographs, images of prisoners at various stages of infection, images of surgical procedures, images of field tests where biological weapons were deployed on Chinese villages to test their effectiveness in real-world conditions. These weren't casual war crimes committed in the chaos of combat. These were carefully planned, methodically executed research programs with explicit approval from Japanese military command. Unit 731 operated with a budget equivalent to tens of millions of dollars in today's money. It employed over 3,000 staff members. And it produced data that legitimate medical science couldn't replicate, ethically. Which brings us to the impossible question that Allied military and scientific leadership faced in 1945. They just won a war against enemies who had committed unspeakable atrocities. The moral position was clear: prosecute the criminals, burn the evidence of their crimes, ensure that evil cannot profit from evil. But the practical position was more complicated. Because American forces were preparing for a potential invasion of Japan that would cost hundreds of thousands of Allied lives. And they were facing the possibility of future conflicts with the Soviet Union, which was also trying to obtain Axis research data. And they had soldiers who might die from cold injuries or biological warfare that this research could help prevent. So the question became, do you destroy morally tainted data even if it means soldiers die from conditions that the data could have helped treat? The answer the Allies gave to that question was far more complex than yes or no, and it involved deals with the devil that remained classified for over 40 years. But before we get to those deals, there's another set of experiments we need to discuss. Because while Unit 731 was conducting biological warfare research in Manchuria, Nazi Germany was conducting its own systematic human experimentation program. And the data the Allies seized from Nazi laboratories was just as comprehensive, just as scientifically valuable, and just as morally reprehensible. Stay with me, because what happened with the Nazi research data will blow your mind. Make sure you're subscribed because Part 2 reveals the secret deals, the immunity agreements, and exactly how this tainted data shaped modern medicine in ways you use every single day. Dachau Concentration Camp, January 1943. The same kind of frostbite research that Unit 731 was conducting in Manchuria was happening here, but with German efficiency and documentation. SS physician Dr. Sigmund Rascher was overseeing hypothermia experiments that German military command had ordered to help Luftwaffe pilots survive being shot down over the North Sea. The experiments were brutally simple in concept. Take concentration camp prisoners, immerse them in tanks of ice water, record how long until they lose consciousness, how long until their hearts stop, what their core body temperature is at various stages, then test different rewarming methods to see which ones worked best. The results were documented with Germanic thoroughness. Temperature charts showing the minute-by-minute decline in core body temperature. Graphs correlating water temperature to time until unconsciousness. Tables showing which rewarming methods saved the most test subjects. And unlike Unit 731's research, which Allied forces only discovered after the war, some of this Nazi data was actually presented at medical conferences. In 1942, Dr. Rascher presented preliminary findings at a Luftwaffe medical conference, claiming the research would save German pilots' lives. Some German doctors who attended were horrified. Others took notes. The experiments killed approximately 90 prisoners at Dachau alone. But they generated data that answered questions Allied military medicine was also asking, because American, British, and Canadian forces were also losing pilots over cold waters. And they didn't have ethical data on human responses to extreme cold immersion. So when American forces captured Dachau in April 1945, they discovered Dr. Rascher's complete research archives. Every experiment was documented. Every variable was recorded. Every prisoner who died was noted with clinical detachment. The data was horrifying. It was also scientifically rigorous, and American military medical officers immediately recognized its potential value. But the hypothermia experiments weren't the only Nazi medical research that Allied forces seized. There were high-altitude experiments testing human responses to sudden decompression, research relevant to high-altitude bomber crews. There were experiments on treating wounds with different methods, data relevant to battlefield medicine. There were even experiments on treating infectious diseases, though the treatments often killed the test subjects. The Nazis and Japanese weren't just committing random atrocities. They were answering specific military medical questions. And the Allies were facing those exact same questions. Comment below. If you were the Allied commander, what would you have done with this data? As Allied forces advanced through Germany in 1945, they systematically seized medical research archives. Not just from concentration camps, but from SS medical facilities, Wehrmacht research centers, and German universities that had collaborated with the Nazi regime. The operation was called Operation Paperclip, though that name is more famous for recruiting German rocket scientists than for seizing medical data. Teams of American scientists followed behind combat troops, specifically to secure research, materials before Soviet forces could reach them, because the Cold War was already beginning, even though World War II hadn't officially ended yet. And both American and Soviet military leadership understood that whoever controlled Axis research data would have a scientific advantage. In some cases, American forces literally raced Soviet troops to reach laboratories and archives first. The competition was so intense that some facilities were looted by both sides, Americans taking physical documents while Soviets grabbed equipment and captured scientists. By late 1945, the United States had accumulated over 3,000 crates of Nazi medical research. Everything from legitimate pharmaceutical development to concentration camp experiment documentation. All of it was shipped to America, initially to the Army Medical Library in Washington, D.C., later to various military research facilities. Soviet forces accumulated comparable amounts of data, though Soviet archival records are less accessible than American declassified documents. And both sides face the same question: what do we do with knowledge gained through atrocity? The Soviet answer appears to have been straightforward. Use it. Soviet military medicine incorporated Nazi cold weather research into training protocols. Soviet biological warfare programs built on Japanese and German data. The Soviet Union never acknowledged a moral dilemma because Soviet ideology didn't require acknowledging that Nazi and Japanese prisoners had been human beings who deserved protection. The American answer was more complicated, because American military leadership wanted to use the data, but American public opinion and political leadership demanded that Nazi and Japanese war criminals be prosecuted, and those two goals were in direct conflict. You can't prosecute someone for war crimes while simultaneously giving them immunity in exchange for their research data. Or rather, you can, but you have to keep it secret. That's exactly what happened. And the deals the Allies made, the scientists they protected, and the data they used remained classified for decades. Subscribe now because Part 2 reveals the specific immunity agreements, the scientists who walked free, and how this tainted data is still affecting medicine today. Let's talk about Dr. Sigmund Rascher, the man who oversaw the Dachau hypothermia experiments. You'd expect he was executed for war crimes, right? Put on trial at Nuremberg, convicted, hanged like other Nazi officials responsible for medical atrocities? He wasn't. Rascher was actually arrested by the SS in 1944. Not for medical war crimes, but for financial corruption and fabricating his wife's medical credentials. He died in Dachau concentration camp just days before Allied forces liberated it, likely executed by SS guards who were eliminating evidence before the Allies arrived, which meant he was never put on trial, never forced to testify about his experiments. never publicly associated with the specific research data that American military medical officers were already preparing to analyze and potentially use. Convenient? Maybe. Or maybe the SS eliminated him specifically to prevent him from being captured and testifying about research programs that went far beyond his specific experiments. But if Rascher's fate was complex, the fate of Unit 731's leadership was even more disturbing, because while some Nazi doctors were prosecuted at Nuremberg, not a single member of Unit 731's staff was ever charged with war crimes by Allied authorities. Not one, despite documented evidence of at least 3,000 murders, despite photographs and testimony proving systematic human experimentation, despite the fact that what Unit 731 did was arguably worse than anything the Nazis had done. Why? Because General Douglas MacArthur, the Supreme Commander of Allied occupation forces in Japan, made a deal. A secret deal that protected Unit 731's entire command, structure in exchange for their research data, and cooperation with American military biological warfare programs. The deal was negotiated in 1946 between American occupation authorities and Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, Unit 731's commander. Ishii would provide complete documentation of all Unit 731 experiments. He would debrief American scientists on experimental methods and results. He would make his entire staff available for consultation. In exchange, Ishii and every member of Unit 731 would receive immunity from prosecution. No war crimes trials. No public exposure. They would be allowed to return to civilian life in Japan as if they'd simply been conducting legitimate military medical research. This wasn't a rogue operation. This was official U.S. policy, approved at the highest levels. And it remained secret until the 1980s when investigative journalists finally uncovered the truth. If this story is enraging you, shocking you, or making you question everything you thought you knew about the good guys of World War II, hit that like button and drop a comment. This conversation needs to happen. The justification for the immunity deal was straightforward from a military perspective. American biological warfare researchers believed that Unit 731's data was invaluable for defensive purposes. If the Soviet Union or another adversary used biological weapons, understanding how those weapons affected human populations could save American lives. Moreover, American intelligence believed the Soviets were also trying to recruit Japanese biological warfare experts. If America didn't secure Unit 731's cooperation, the USSR would, and then American forces would face biological weapons, developed with knowledge we'd refuse to acquire. This logic, that refusing tainted data meant ceding a strategic advantage to enemies, drove much of the Allied decision-making about Axis medical research. Moral purity was a luxury that military planners believed they couldn't afford, but the deals went further than just immunity. Some Nazi scientists were actually recruited to work directly for American military research programs. Operation Paperclip brought over 1,600 German scientists to America, most of them engineers and physicists working on rockets and aerospace. But buried in that program were medical researchers too, not concentration camp experimenters. Those were too politically toxic to bring to America. But scientists who'd worked on legitimate pharmaceutical research for Nazi Germany, or who'd conducted human experiments on prisoners but could claim they were following orders rather than personally responsible for atrocities. These scientists weren't advertised. They weren't celebrated like Werner von Braun and the rocket team. They worked in military medical facilities, their Nazi pasts sanitized in official records, their expertise utilized while their histories remained classified. And the data itself, the hundreds of thousands of pages of Nazi and Japanese experimental results, some was archived, marked top secret, and locked away. Some was distributed to military medical, researchers with all identifying information, removed, presented as captured enemy research, without acknowledging exactly how that research was obtained, and some of it was actually used, applied to military medicine, incorporated into training protocols, published in classified military medical journals with references to German cold weather, studies, or Japanese biological warfare research, without ever explicitly stating that the research involved human experimentation on prisoners. We're about to get into the specific ways this data was used, and some of it will surprise you. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on. Part 2 will reveal exactly how Nazi hypothermia data saved Allied lives, how Unit 731 research shaped American biological warfare programs, and the medical ethics revolution that these atrocities eventually sparked. Here's where this story gets even more complex. Because it's easy to say the Allies should have burned the data and prosecuted everyone. But when you look at the specific applications, the moral calculus gets extremely uncomfortable. Take the hypothermia. Research. Dr. Rascher's Dachau experiments produced data showing that rapid rewarming, putting frozen victims in hot water, was actually worse than gradual rewarming. It caused cardiac arrest. The Nazi research identified the optimal rewarming protocol: gradual warming at controlled temperatures with careful monitoring of core body temperature. That information directly contradicted what Allied military medicine had been teaching. American and British naval rescue protocols called for putting hypothermia victims in hot baths as quickly as possible. Based on the Nazi data, that protocol was killing people who could have been saved. So American military medicine changed its protocols. The 1952 manual Cold Injury in Man, published by the U.S. Navy, explicitly credited German frozen immersion experiments 1943-44 in its preface. The new protocols saved lives. American pilots shot down over cold water, sailors rescued from the North Atlantic, even civilian mountaineers and cold weather workers. Lives saved because of data obtained by literally freezing concentration camp prisoners to death. Is that acceptable? Is saving American lives with knowledge gained from Nazi atrocities justified? Or does using the data dishonor the victims by suggesting their suffering had purpose? There's no easy answer. But the Allies clearly made a choice. They decided that refusing to use knowledge that could save lives was itself a form of moral failure, even if the knowledge was tainted. The same logic applied to Unit 731 data. Japanese biological warfare research had identified optimal antibody responses to various pathogens. They documented infection rates. They'd tested vaccine effectiveness under conditions that no ethical researcher could replicate. American biological warfare researchers working at facilities like Fort Detrick in Maryland used that data to develop defensive countermeasures, not to create offensive biological weapons, though the line between defense and offense in biological warfare is fuzzy, but to understand how to protect American troops if biological weapons were used against them. Comment below. Is using Nazi and Japanese data to save Allied lives justified? Or should the data have been destroyed regardless of its potential value? This is the debate that still continues today among medical ethicists. Operation Whitecoat was the code name for American biological warfare defense research that drew directly on Unit 731 data. Between 1954 and 1973, the U.S. Army recruited volunteer test subjects, mostly Seventh-day Adventist conscientious objectors who agreed to be exposed to disease agents to test vaccines and treatments. These were volunteers, given full informed consent, protected by medical supervision, ethical by modern standards, as ethical as deliberately exposing humans to disease can be. But the experimental protocols were based on Japanese research that wasn't ethical at all. Declassified documents from Operation Whitecoat explicitly reference Japanese biological warfare data and Unit 731 infection studies. The researchers knew exactly where the baseline information came from. They just never publicly acknowledged it. The same pattern appears in multiple areas of military medicine. High-altitude physiology research, used to protect pilots flying at extreme altitudes, drew on Nazi decompression chamber experiments. Battlefield trauma protocols incorporated findings from Nazi wound experiments. Even some drug testing protocols were influenced by Nazi pharmaceutical research, not always with explicit citations. Often the data was presented as captured enemy research or German studies, without the details about how those studies were conducted. The taint was laundered through classification and vague sourcing. But the knowledge was used, and lives were likely saved because of it. This creates an impossible ethical equation. On one side, honoring victims by refusing to profit from their suffering. On the other side, saving lives using knowledge that can't be obtained any other way. The Allies chose to save lives. They chose practicality over purity, and they kept the choice secret for decades because they knew public opinion would condemn it. Was that the right choice? That's not for me to tell you. That's a question every person has to answer for themselves. But what's undeniable is that Allied leadership faced a real dilemma with no good options, and the choice they made shaped military medicine and medical ethics for generations. We're going to pause Part 1 here because Part 2 gets even more intense. We'll cover the Nuremberg Code, how these atrocities actually created modern medical ethics, and the legacy question, should tainted data ever be used? Subscribe now, hit that notification bell, and drop your thoughts in the comments. This is history we need to discuss, even when it's uncomfortable. The Nuremberg trials began on November 20th, 1945. The world watched as Nazi leadership faced justice for crimes against humanity. Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, Albert Speer, the architects of the Third Reich, stood in the dock answering for their roles in genocide and aggression. But there was a second Nuremberg trial that most people don't know about. A trial specifically focused on medical atrocities. The doctor's trial, officially known as United States of America versus Karl Brandt et al., began on December 9, 1946. 23 defendants, physicians, administrators, and Nazi officials involved in human experimentation, faced charges that included murder, torture, and crimes against humanity. The evidence presented was horrifying. Prosecutors showed photographs of experiments. They read testimony from survivors. They presented documents signed by the defendants authorizing procedures that any ethical physician would refuse to perform. The case seemed open and shut. These were clearly war criminals who deserved the harshest punishment. But as the trial progressed, a disturbing question emerged, a question that the prosecutors couldn't fully answer, because answering it would reveal secrets that Allied governments wanted kept classified. The question was simple. If these experiments were so clearly unethical, why had Allied military authorities seized the data and in some cases already begun using it? The defense attorneys naturally asked this question repeatedly. They pointed out that American military medical research was citing German cold weather studies. They noted that American authorities had given immunity to Japanese experimenters in exchange for their data. They argued that if the Allies considered the research valuable enough to use, how could they simultaneously prosecute the researchers who produced it? The prosecutors never gave a satisfactory answer to that question. They couldn't, without admitting that American military policy was contradicting the moral foundation of the trial itself. This contradiction, prosecuting Nazis while simultaneously using their research, is at the heart of one of the most uncomfortable truths about World War II. If this story is making you question things you thought you knew for certain, hit that like button and keep watching. The contradictions get even worse. The doctor's trial ultimately convicted 16 of the 23 defendants. 7 were sentenced to death and hanged on June 2, 1948. 9 received prison sentences ranging from 10 years to life. 7 were acquitted. But the trial's most important legacy wasn't the convictions. It was the ethical code that emerged from it. Because the judges, in their final decision, included a section outlining 10 principles for ethical human experimentation, principles that became known as the Nuremberg Code. The first principle was unambiguous. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. No coercion, no deception, full disclosure of risks. And critically, the subject must have the legal capacity to give consent, meaning prisoners, People under duress or people with diminished mental capacity couldn't ethically be used as test subjects even if they technically agreed. This principle directly condemned everything that Unit 731, Nazi experimenters and concentration camp doctors had done, but it also created an uncomfortable problem for Allied military medicine, which routinely used soldiers, people who couldn't refuse, orders, as test subjects in various research programs. The Nuremberg Code's second principle stated that experiments should only be conducted when necessary to solve important problems, and only when the risk was justified by the potential benefit. Third principle: experiments should be based on prior animal studies and understanding of the disease or problem being studied. Fourth, all unnecessary suffering and injury should be avoided. Reading through all 10 principles, you realize they were written specifically to prevent the kind of research that Nazis and Japanese had conducted, research that prioritized data collection over human welfare, research that treated people as disposable objects rather than as individuals with rights. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The Nuremberg Code was aspirational, not immediately binding. It took decades for these principles to be fully integrated into medical research protocols. And during those decades, Allied military medical research continued to conduct experiments that violated several Nuremberg Code principles. The code that we celebrate as the foundation of modern medical ethics was born from prosecuting atrocities that we secretly benefited from. Drop a comment on whether you think that hypocrisy invalidates the code's moral authority, or whether good principles can emerge from compromised circumstances. Let me give you specific examples of how the Nuremberg Code was, let's say, flexibly interpreted by the same Allied governments that prosecuted the doctor's trial. The Tuskegee syphilis study, conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service from 1932 to 1972, yes, it continued for decades after the Nuremberg Code was written, deliberately withheld treatment from black men infected with syphilis to study the disease's natural progression. The subjects weren't given informed consent. They weren't told they had syphilis. They were lied to and told they were receiving free health care. That's a direct violation of Nuremberg Code Principles 1, 3, and 4. And it was conducted by the American government for 40 years after American prosecutors argued that Nazi doctors should hang for similar violations. MK-Ultra, the CIA's mind control research program from 1953 to 1973, administered LSD and other drugs to unwitting test subjects, including prisoners, psychiatric patients, and even CIA employees who didn't know they were being dosed. That's a Nuremberg Code violation, conducted by the American government, using some methodologies that drew on Nazi research into drugs and psychological manipulation. Operation Whitecoat, which we mentioned in Part 1, was more ethical. It used volunteers who gave informed consent. But even there, the question of whether soldiers could truly volunteer without coercion is complicated. Can someone in military service really refuse to participate in something their commanding officer presents as important to national defense? The point isn't that Allied nations were as bad as the Nazis. They weren't, not by any reasonable comparison. The point is that the moral high ground we claimed at Nuremberg was built on foundation of pragmatic compromises that we weren't honest about. We prosecuted Nazi doctors while using their data. We created ethical codes while violating those codes in classified programs. We condemned human experimentation while conducting our own. The hypocrisy was real, and it raises a question that still matters today. Can you build genuine ethical progress on a foundation of moral compromise? That question is at the heart of this entire story. Subscribe and turn on notifications because we're about to dig into specific scientists who escaped justice, and their fates will shock you. Let's talk about Shiro Ishii, the man who commanded Unit 731 and oversaw experiments that killed thousands. After the war ended and American occupation forces took control of Japan, Ishii went into hiding. He knew he was a wanted man. Soviet forces had overrun the Pingfang facility and discovered enough evidence to understand what had happened there. The Soviets wanted Ishii and his staff for war crimes trials. But American occupation authorities wanted something else. They wanted Ishii's cooperation, his data, his expertise in biological warfare that could inform American defensive programs and potentially keep that knowledge away from the Soviets. So, in 1946, American military authorities offered Ishii a deal: full immunity from prosecution in exchange for complete cooperation. All Unit 731 data would be turned over to American custody. Ishii and his staff would debrief American scientists on their experimental methods, and in return, no one from Unit 731 would ever face trial, Ishii accepted. He spent several months providing detailed briefings to American biological warfare researchers. He turned over thousands of pages of documentation. He answered technical questions about experimental methodologies, and then he was allowed to return to civilian life. He wasn't just set free, he was protected. When the Soviet Union demanded that General MacArthur turn over Unit 731 personnel for war crimes trials, MacArthur's staff claimed they had no information about biological warfare experiments. They stated that Unit 731 appeared to have been a standard military medical unit, and there was no evidence of war crimes. Maybe, maybe not, but the relevant question isn't whether these scientists contributed valuable knowledge. The question is whether their contributions justified protecting them from consequences for their participation in Nazi atrocities. And America's answer, through its actions if not its public statements, was yes. Knowledge and strategic advantage were worth more than justice. This wasn't unique to America. The Soviet Union recruited Nazi scientists too, often forcing them to work in Soviet facilities rather than offering them the comfortable civilian lives that America provided. Britain quietly employed Nazi specialists in various fields. Every major Allied power made similar compromises, but that doesn't make it less troubling. It just means the moral failure was widespread, and it raises the question that haunts this entire story. If we compromised our ethical principles to gain strategic advantage, can we legitimately claim moral superiority over our enemies? Or does winning through moral compromise mean we lost something more important than any military conflict? Before we get to the lasting legacy and the medical ethics revolution these atrocities sparked, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. The final section reveals how these dark chapters actually created the ethical frameworks that protect research subjects today. And comment your thoughts. This is a conversation worth having. Here's the strange irony at the heart of this story. The same atrocities that Allied governments tried to suppress, minimize, or benefit from secretly became the catalyst for the most important revolution in medical ethics in human history. The Nuremberg Code wasn't just a list of principles written for a trial and then forgotten. It became the foundation for everything that came after. The Declaration of Helsinki in 1964, which expanded ethical principles for medical research. The Belmont Report in 1979, which established ethical guidelines for American research involving human subjects. Every modern institutional review board that reviews medical research proposals traces its authority and principles back to Nuremberg. The Nazi and Japanese experiments showed the world what happens when medical research proceeds without ethical constraints, when scientists treat human subjects as objects, when the pursuit of knowledge becomes untethered from respect for human dignity. The horrors documented at the doctor's trial created such revulsion that even governments that had secretly benefited from the data couldn't publicly defend it. So, while American, Soviet, and other Allied authorities were secretly using Axis research data, they were simultaneously supporting the development of ethical frameworks that condemned how that data was obtained. The hypocrisy was remarkable, but the ethical frameworks that emerged were genuine and important. Today, any medical research involving human subjects must pass review by ethics boards that evaluate whether the research respects participants' autonomy, minimizes harm, and distributes risks and benefits fairly. Informed consent isn't just recommended, it's legally required. Coercion of any kind disqualifies research from legitimate publication. These protections exist because of Nuremberg, because the world saw what happened when they didn't exist and collectively said, "Never again." But, and this is where the story comes full circle, does the good that came from Nuremberg's ethical revolution justify the compromises that preceded it? Does the fact that we now have strong research ethics erase the moral failure of secretly using Nazi and Japanese data? I don't think there's a clean answer to that question. The ethical progress is real and important. The hypocrisy is also real and troubling. Both things can be true simultaneously. Final question before we wrap up. If you were a medical researcher today and someone offered you data from Nazi or Japanese experiments that could save lives but couldn't be obtained any other way, would you use it? Comment below with your honest answer. There's no right response, just your genuine ethical judgment. Let's talk about the modern implications. Because this isn't just historical curiosity. The questions raised by Allied use of Nazi and Japanese data are still relevant. Should tainted data ever be cited in medical literature? There's active debate about this. Some medical ethicists argue that citing Nazi hypothermia research, for example, validates and legitimizes research that should be condemned. That citation gives the research academic credibility that it doesn't deserve. Others argue that refusing to cite the source is dishonest. If your treatment protocol was influenced by Nazi data, academic integrity requires acknowledging that source, however uncomfortable. Pretending the influence doesn't exist is a form of historical erasure. There's no consensus. Some medical journals will publish research that cites Nazi experiments if the citation includes ethical commentary condemning how the data was obtained. Other journals refuse to publish anything that references Nazi research at all. The same debate extends to using data from any unethical source. China has been accused of conducting unethical medical research on prisoners. Some pharmaceutical research in developing countries involves practices that wouldn't be allowed in Western nations. If that research produces valuable medical knowledge, should it be used? The Nuremberg Code says no. But the existence of the Nuremberg Code doesn't mean countries always follow it. And if other countries produce valuable data through unethical means, refusing to use it doesn't prevent the unethical research from happening. It just means we don't benefit from it while they do. These are impossible questions with no easy answers. But they're questions that medical researchers and ethicists grapple with constantly. The uncomfortable truth is that medicine's progress has sometimes been built on morally compromised foundations. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into ethical dilemmas in history and science. And share this video. These conversations need to happen publicly, not just in academic journals. So, what did the Allies really gain from Nazi and Japanese human experiments? Let me summarize the uncomfortable truth. Practically, they gained data that informed military medicine, biological warfare defense, cold weather protocols, high-altitude physiology, and various other fields. Some of that data likely saved lives. American pilots who survived cold water immersion benefited from protocols based on Nazi research. Soldiers protected by vaccines developed with reference to Unit 731 data avoided diseases that might have killed them. The practical benefits were real, even if discussing them feels like dishonoring the victims whose suffering produced that knowledge. Strategically, the Allies gained advantage over the Soviet Union. By securing Axis research data and recruiting Axis scientists, American and Soviet forces believed they were protecting their national security interests in an emerging Cold War. Whether that advantage was worth the moral compromises is debatable, but the strategic calculation was clear. Ethically, the world gained the Nuremberg Code and everything that flowed from it. The revulsion at Nazi and Japanese experiments created momentum for the strongest medical ethics frameworks in human history. Modern research protections exist because of Nuremberg. That's a genuine gain, even if it emerged from hypocrisy. But the Allies also lost something. They lost moral clarity. They lost the ability to claim absolute ethical superiority over their enemies. They demonstrated that when strategic interests conflict with ethical principles, even democratic nations will compromise those principles. That's not to say the Allies were equivalent to the Axis powers. They weren't. The scale of Nazi and Japanese atrocities far exceeded anything Allied nations did. But the moral distance isn't infinite. It's smaller than we'd like to believe, and recognizing that is important. This was a lie. American authorities had detailed evidence. They had Ishii's own debriefings. They had the archives, but they were protecting their source. Ishii lived quietly in Tokyo for the rest of his life. He ran a medical clinic. He saw patients. He became a successful businessman. When he died in 1959 of throat cancer, he'd never spent a single day in prison, never faced trial, never publicly acknowledged what he'd done. The American government's protection meant he faced no consequences whatsoever. A man responsible for torturing and killing. Thousands of people lived free because we valued his data, more than justice for his victims. If that doesn't enrage you, it should. Like this video if you believe war criminals should face justice regardless of what they can offer us. But Ishii wasn't the only one. Let me give you names of other Unit 731 personnel and what happened to them after the war, because this is where the moral failure becomes impossible to ignore. Dr. Masaji Kitano, Ishii's second-in-command at Unit 731, conducted plague experiments, vivisections, and field tests of biological weapons on Chinese civilians. After the war, ran a successful pharmaceutical company in Tokyo. Lived until 1986. Never prosecuted. Dr. Ryoichi Naito, senior researcher at Unit 731 who specialized in plague bacteria and headed one of the facility's main research divisions. After the war, founded the Japan Blood Bank, which later became Green Cross Corporation, one of Japan's largest pharmaceutical companies. Lived until 1982. Never prosecuted. Actually became rich and respected in Japanese medical circles. Lieutenant Colonel Yoshio Shinozuka, another senior Unit 731 researcher. After the war, lived quietly in Japan until the 1990s, when he voluntarily came forward and confessed his role in Unit 731. By then, he was elderly and faced no prosecution. He became one of the few former Unit 731 members to publicly acknowledge what they'd done. Surgeon General Masatomo Yamaguchi, who oversaw human dissections at Unit 731. After the war, became president of Osaka University Medical School. Trained the next generation of Japanese physicians. Retired with honors. Died in 1975. Never prosecuted. Do you see the pattern? Not one faced justice. Many became successful in civilian life. Some became wealthy. Some held positions of authority and respect, because American occupation authorities protected them in exchange for their cooperation with American biological warfare research programs. The deal was secret. The American public didn't know. The victims' families didn't know. And when the Soviet Union conducted its own war crimes trial for Unit 731 members they'd captured, American authorities dismissed it as propaganda. Comment below. How many American lives would it take to justify protecting these men from prosecution? 10? 100? 1,000? At what number does protecting war criminals become acceptable? Keep watching because the ethical calculations get even more complex. Here's where this gets even more uncomfortable, because we're not just talking about protection after the war. We're talking about active collaboration between American military researchers and former Unit 731 scientists, Fort Detrick, Maryland. This was the center of American biological warfare research during the Cold War. In the late 1940s and through the 1950s, researchers at Fort Detrick were using data provided by Ishii and his team. They were analyzing Japanese experimental results, incorporating findings into American research protocols, and in some cases consulting with Japanese scientists about technical questions. Classified documents that weren't declassified until the 1990s show that American biological warfare researchers explicitly referenced Japanese human experiment data in their work. They didn't just passively use data that had been collected. They actively sought out additional information, asking follow-up questions about experimental methodologies and results. This wasn't a one-time transaction where Americans received documents and then broke contact. This was ongoing collaboration between American military scientists and Japanese war criminals, mediated by American occupation authorities and kept secret under national security classification. The justification was always the same. Soviet biological warfare programs were a threat to American security. Understanding how biological weapons affected human populations was essential for developing defensive countermeasures. Refusing to use Japanese data meant ceding a strategic advantage to the USSR. But that justification required accepting that national security interests outweighed justice for victims. That American lives potentially saved in some future conflict mattered more than accountability for thousands of Chinese, Korean, Russian, and other prisoners tortured and killed at Unit 731. It required making peace with the fact that we became complicit in covering up atrocities by protecting the perpetrators, and the American government made that deal, made it willingly, made it with full knowledge of what Unit 731 had done, and kept it secret for decades because they knew public opinion would reject it. We're going to shift now to the Nazi scientists who escaped justice, and their stories are equally disturbing. Make sure you're subscribed because this historical reckoning isn't over yet. And share this video. These stories need to be told, even though they're uncomfortable. Operation Paperclip brought approximately 1,600 German scientists to America after World War II. Most of them were engineers and physicists working on rockets, jet engines, and aerospace technology. The most famous was Wernher von Braun, who'd developed V-2 rockets for Nazi Germany and later became the architect of America's space program. Von Braun's Nazi past was sanitized in public records. His membership in the SS was downplayed. His use of slave labor in V-2 rocket production facilities was minimized, because he was valuable to American military interests, and confronting the full truth of his Nazi involvement would have made it politically impossible to employ him. But von Braun wasn't involved in medical experimentation. His moral compromises were about using slave labor and developing weapons, not about torturing prisoners in laboratory settings. Other Operation Paperclip recruits had more direct involvement in medical atrocities. Dr. Hubertus Strughold, for example. He was recruited to America in 1947 to work on aerospace medicine, research about how altitude, pressure, and acceleration affect human physiology. His work was crucial to developing American high-altitude flight and eventually space exploration. What wasn't publicized was that Strughold had been present at a 1942 medical conference where Nazi experiments on human responses to high altitude were discussed. Evidence suggests he was aware of and possibly participated in planning experiments that killed concentration camp prisoners at Dachau. After the war, American authorities cleaned up his record. References to his Nazi-era activities were removed from his personnel file. He was presented as a simple scientist who'd worked for Germany but wasn't personally involved in atrocities. He went on to become the father of space medicine in America, receiving NASA honors and having facilities named after him. It wasn't until the 1980s that investigative journalists uncovered his Nazi connections. By then he was elderly and faced no prosecution. The NASA facility that bore his name was quietly renamed, but he'd spent decades benefiting from American protection while his victims' families had no idea he was living comfortably in America. How many of the scientists who helped America win the space race and develop advanced medicine had Nazi pasts that were deliberately hidden? The answer will disturb you. Drop a like if you think we need to confront these histories honestly, even when they complicate national narratives we're proud of. The pattern repeated across dozens of German scientists recruited through Operation Paperclip and similar programs. Their Nazi pasts were sanitized. Their involvement in atrocities was minimized or hidden entirely, and they were integrated into American military research. Their expertise valued more than accountability for their actions. Some genuinely had minimal involvement in Nazi atrocities. They were scientists, working on legitimate research who happened to be in Germany during the Nazi period, but others had direct involvement in programs that killed people, and American authorities made little effort to distinguish between the two, because the priority was securing scientific expertise, not administering justice. This creates an impossible counterfactual question. Would America have achieved its Cold War technological successes without Nazi scientists? Would we have landed on the moon without von Braun? Would our aerospace medicine be as advanced without Strughold? Final thoughts. The Allied use of Nazi and Japanese experiment data reveals an uncomfortable truth about how nations behave under pressure. When survival or strategic advantage seems to require moral compromise, even the good guys will compromise. That doesn't make them villains, but it does mean they're not moral paragons either. They're humans making difficult choices in impossible circumstances. The legacy of this story is complex. We built medical ethics frameworks on atrocities we secretly exploited. We prosecuted war criminals while protecting others who were useful to us. We condemned human experimentation while conducting classified programs that violated the same principles we championed publicly. Does that hypocrisy invalidate the ethical progress we made? I don't think so. Good principles can emerge from compromised circumstances. The Nuremberg Code's value doesn't depend on whether the governments that created it lived up to its standards. It stands on its own merits. But we need to be honest about the hypocrisy, about the deals we made, about the scientists we protected, about the data we used while publicly condemning how it was obtained. Because honesty about our moral failures is the only path toward genuine ethical progress. The victims of Nazi and Japanese experiments deserve that honesty. They deserve acknowledgement that their suffering was exploited even as it was condemned, that their deaths produced knowledge that benefited the nations that failed to deliver justice. And we, as inheritors of that history, deserve honesty too, because we can't learn from history if we sanitize it. We can't make better choices if we pretend previous choices were always righteous. The Allied use of Nazi and Japanese experiment data was a moral compromise. It produced practical benefits and strategic advantages. It also produced lasting ethical frameworks that protect research subjects today. All of those things are true, and holding all of those truths simultaneously is uncomfortable, but necessary. That's the real lesson. History is complicated. Moral clarity is rare, and sometimes the good guys make terrible choices that haunt us decades later. If this deep dive changed how you think about World War II, medical ethics, or moral compromise, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm genuinely curious what you think about these impossible ethical dilemmas. Thank you for watching one of the most difficult and controversial historical topics we've covered. These stories need to be told honestly, even when, especially when, they make us uncomfortable. Check out our other videos for more deep dives into history's ethical gray zones. And remember, understanding our past's moral failures is the only way to avoid repeating them.